Today is Monday, March 7th, 2011. My name is Frieda Reitman, and it's my pleasure today to interview Lois Kolodny at her home in Stamford as part of the Oral History Archive of the Jewish Historical Society of Lower Fairfield County. After so many postponements due to weather, I have really been looking forward to this day. The cameraman today is Julian Reitman. Start with your birth family background, if you'll fill us in a little bit about your parents.
Well, my mother was born in the United States in 1906. My father was born in Russia and in 1902 and came here at the age of 2. So, for all practical purposes, he was educated and everything here in the States. They lived in Brooklyn. It was really a shidduch arranged by my mother's mother and my father's mother. They were society ladies and they got the two together. And it was a marriage made in heaven. They were wonderful parents to me. I'm an only child. And they were wonderful grandparents. And to this day they are sorely missed by one and all.
My goodness, okay, that's a neat start. Do you have some childhood memories you'd like to record for us? Things about your family, or particularly since this is the Jewish Historical Society, if there are any memories of holidays or things of this sort. And I assume that Brooklyn, where you lived, had a lot of Jewish people. Is that correct?
Oh yes, we lived in a very Jewish community. Nobody was in school on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, even though the schools were open. I think all the kids were in one classroom. That's how many there were. My father went to temple every Saturday. We'd always have a group of men back at the house for Kiddush afterwards. But yet they were not Sharma Shabbases, but he enjoyed going to temple and holidays, especially Pesach, was 20 people, 25 people around the table, all family. And I'm an only child, but my father's sisters were there, and my mother's mother was there, and it was wonderful. It was. We loved it. Passover was, today is my favorite holiday. It's one thing that spoils it. My mother passed away the first day Chol Hamoed Pesach. But Pesach is a wonderful holiday, and all the holidays were like that.
Well, that's good that you have those nice holidays to remember.
Yeah, they were great.
What about school holidays? Where did you go to school? And I mean holidays, but school in general in Brooklyn?
I went to school. I was born and brought up in Brooklyn. I left Brooklyn to come to Stamford. That was it. I graduated 8th grade from PS 167 in Brooklyn. I went to Erasmus Hall High School. Graduated from there in January of 1947. Went to Pratt Institute and graduated from there in June 1950 as a dietitian. I worked in New York. I graduated in May of 50, got married in August of 1950 to my husband that I was engaged to for 2 years. Got married on his birthday. I said I'd get married on his birthday because he'd never forget it. He'd never forget our anniversary. And if he did, I'd forget his birthday.
Okay.
And so it was and then in 1951 we moved to Stamford. My husband was a research chemist at American Cyanamid.
Well, there are a lot of American Cyanamid people in Stamford.
That's right.
In terms of the place where you lived before you got married, was that a home, a private home, or a apartment, or?
We lived in an apartment house for until I was about 7 or 8 years old. Then right next door to the apartment house, my grandmother, my mother's mother, owned a two-family house, and she had a tenant upstairs. The tenant moved out, and my mother decided that we were going to move in. So we lived in a two-family house. My grandmother and my mother's two sisters lived downstairs until they got married, and then we lived upstairs. So it was really like a one-family house.
See, that's very different from other people's background.
Right.
So
But
this
it
is
was
really
like a
different.
one-family house. Shabbos, we were all together for dinner. And holidays, of course, we were all together. And my mother was very active in society, so to speak, in organizations. If she wasn't home when I came home from school, my grandmother was. And because my grandmother was not born here, but she was a very smart lady. And
Was English the main language in your home?
yes, except when they didn't want me to know what they were saying, then they talk in Yiddish. My grandmother spoke English, she wrote English, she read English, and when they didn't want me, as I say, if they didn't want me to know what they were talking about, they talk in Yiddish. That's how I picked up Yiddish.
Okay. And then, so that you got married and came to Stanford.
The first year we were married, we lived in Brooklyn with my folks. We could not, well, we got married in 2 weeks. My husband called me one day at work and said, it's time. I was engaged for 2 years. He wouldn't get married before I graduated. That was the condition that I got my ring, so that's why it was 2 years. So then it was 1950 and the Korean War broke out. And they were talking about drafting World War II veterans that were not married. So he decided, we waited 2 years, we were both out of college, we were both working. Of course, we couldn't afford it, but let's get married. Enough is enough. So he called my father, my mother, and said he wants to come over and talk to them. So we came over that night and asked permission to get married.
And they were
But-
very surprised, I'm sure.
Yes, but my mother was shocked. She said, when? He said, as soon as possible. And, you know, in those days, whoa, Lois, are you all right? Of course I'm all right. I was mortified that she would even think that. Well, we got married. She put a wedding together in 2 weeks, but my mother was in mourning. My grandmother had passed away, and she really wanted us to wait till the year was up so she could make a big wedding. I was an only child. So we said, no, it didn't matter. We didn't need a wedding, a big wedding, so we had a nice, small Jewish wedding, called the rabbi, and said, when could we get married? And the first day we could get married, it was just before Tisha B'Av. He said, the first day you could get married is Monday, but you don't get married on Monday. So the next day is Tuesday, August 1st. And it turned out it was Eddie's birthday, so that was it. We lived in Brooklyn for a year.
And where did you get married, actually?
In Brooklyn?
In the rabbi's?
No, there was a kosher restaurant in Brooklyn on Kingston Avenue that had a small banquet hall. And we got married there at Rothman's Inn. And we had 27 people at the wedding, just the immediate family. And my maid of honor, who was my best friend, and her husband, and that's it. Because my mother was in mourning, so we didn't have any music. Just us, which was enough. We were still married. Actually, we got married the week before at City Hall. So so we were legal. But as far as my mother and father were concerned, we weren't legal. So, but and we moved up to Stanford in September of '51. My husband got a job up here with Cyanamid. He was working in Jersey at the time at Onyx Oil and Chemical. And then he got this job at Cyanamid.
And you were working at that time?
I was working at the New York Telephone Company as a dining room supervisor.
And where was that?
on West Street, downtown Manhattan. And we lived on President Street, if you know Brooklyn, between Utica and Schenectady Avenue. So I took the express up to down to New York every morning, and that was it. And he schlepped to Jersey.
So Stamford, you both moved together to
Oh
Stamford.
yes. Well, I didn't work when I first came to Stamford. No, they would have transferred me up here, but there was no office no telephone company in Stamford that had a dining room. I'd have to go to Bridgeport, and I didn't want to. So that brought us to Stamford. We lived at Fairlawn for 3 years. My son was born there. And then we moved to a two-family house, and my daughter was born there. Then we moved to the Daycroft Apartments. My husband got sick when he was 30. He developed a heart block. He had a normal pulse rate of 30, 35, so there was no thought of a house or buying a house or anything like that. And then after 8 years of medication, he had the first pacemaker put in up at Yale. And the doctor said he did 40 dogs and then he did Eddie. After that, he was wonderful. He was fine. We lived a normal life, and we bought this house. We moved in 1965. My father had passed away in 1963. My mother moved up here and lived with us in 1966 until she died in 1981. And she didn't live with us, we lived together. And in my mind, there's a big difference. Because when I needed money, I went to my mother. You know, my mother didn't live here because she had to. She lived here because my husband insisted upon it. And that's it. And I have 2 kids, 2 adult children, and 3 adult grandsons, and 1 little grandson, a 12-year-old.
So you raised your children in Stamford.
Absolutely.
And what schools did they go to?
They went to Rogers on Lockwood Avenue. And then when we moved here, Richard, the oldest, went to Dolan, and my daughter went to Newfield for 2 years, and then she went to Dolan. Then they both went to Rippewam.
I know where those places are.
Oh, I would think so.
And
Then they went off to college.
did you find any kind of anti-Semitism in that period in Stamford?
When my husband first worked, when he worked at Cyanamid, he had a boss who was very anti-Semitic. He found out later on. And something came up, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but his boss was talking about all these loud-mouthed Jews. And Eddie turned to him and looked at him, and he says, well, you know, I'm one of them. And my husband was a very soft-spoken man, not like me. And his boss looked at him and says, oh, Ed, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about those New York Jews. He didn't know where Eddie came from. He was born and brought up he wasn't born in Brooklyn, but he was brought up in Brooklyn. He was born in Jacksonville, Florida, and his father was working at the Ford plant and got fired at the Ford plant because he was caught singing "Ailey Ailey." So he got fired because Ford, you know, and that was it. But no, not really. I didn't find too much other than that. I knew I couldn't buy a house in Southfield Point, or I couldn't go into High Cliff, or I couldn't belong to Woodway Country Club, but who cared?
Did you belong to some synagogue? Did the children go to
Agudas Shalom.
Orthodox?
Orthodox. Joined Agudas Shalom. At that time, there was no Reform congregation here. Oh, May I take that?
Yes.
We joined to go to Sholem because I had gone to Temple Bethel for a service. My husband couldn't care less. He said, whatever you wanted to do, you want to join, join. You don't want to join, it's all right. Like I said to him when we got married, I'm going to keep a kosher home because he comes from a nothing background. They're all Jewish, but doesn't mean anything. And I said, I'm going to keep a kosher house because that's where I was brought up. I don't know any other way. He says, as long as there's food on the table, I don't care. And you're a good cook, which I am. So I didn't like the rabbi at Temple Bethel. That was Rabbi Perlman. Very, very reform. They had an organ and they had this and the kitchen wasn't kosher. That wasn't for me. So we joined to go to Sholem, and friends of my dad's, who happened to have been my father's best man when he got married, lived here in Japan. And he had married a Stanford woman. So they belonged there, and it was very comfortable for us. So that's where I belong. My children went to Hebrew school there. They were bar and bas mitzvah there. And I made 4 brisses here in my house on my kitchen table. And that was our life. My daughter married a wonderful, wonderful gal, an Italian, who took instruction because he had told her this before they got married, that the children would be brought up Jewish. And she had to go for instruction so she would know what it was all about. He says, I'm not asking you to convert because I won't ask you to do something I wouldn't do. She said, fine. She went, and then when she finished her instruction, she was like 5 months pregnant, and she said, I want a conversion. So she converted, went to the mikveh. Rabbi Aaron Kranz converted her, and then she insisted upon a Jewish wedding. So I made a Jewish wedding here in the house. Rabbi Aaron Kranz did it. He performed the conversion, so
That worked very well.
went very well, and I have a wonderful, wonderful daughter-in-law. I absolutely adore her. As a matter of fact, I spoke to her last night, and she says, I'm assuming you're planning on coming out this summer. I said, I hope so. She says, well, you better let me know so I can make my schedule. So she takes off from work when I come out. And my daughter has a fantastic husband who also is not Jewish, but did not convert. And she has 2 sons. She was married before and divorced, and he wasn't either. But her oldest son was bar mitzvahed and brought up Jewish, and which is what they are because of the mother. And we're now in the process of getting the little one ready for bar mitzvah. He's 12. We don't know when it's going to be yet, but it will be after his 13th birthday. And that's it. So I've been brought up, my family has been brought up in a Gutter Shalom, yes.
And are there some organizations or activities you'd like to talk about? I'd like to ask you about your career as a dietitian.
Well, I didn't work when I first came up here, and then when Medicare came into effect, they needed a dietitian on their staff, depending upon the size of the facility, a minimum of 8 hours a month. And somebody asked me, in those days there were a lot of little 30-bed mom and pop facilities in Stanford. I don't know if you were aware of it, but there was one on Long Ridge Road, there was one on the corner of Strawberry Hill and Colonial Road, there was one on Fairfield Avenue, and they all needed somebody for 8 hours a month. And there was Cortland Gardens, and they needed more because it was bigger. It was more than 30 beds. At that time it was 90 beds. So that's when I started working. I worked for all these little ones, and I worked for Cortland Gardens and Homestead a couple of days a week. Then I was offered a job as a corporate dietitian for a chain, and I traveled around the state of Connecticut 5 days a week. I did that for 2 years and about 30,000 miles on my car. Of course, I used to go up to Norwich, Connecticut once a week. I'd go up to Enfield, Connecticut once a week. I'd go to Torrington once a week. You know, there was a lot of traveling. Fortunately, gas was 30 some odd cents a gallon. And then I was working at Cortland Gardens for 2 days a week. And then I got a call one day from Walter Hartz, who owned Cortland. He wanted me, my mother told me, she was here at the time, my mother told me that Walter had called and wants you to call him. I was getting awfully tired of traveling, I'll tell you. And I went up to see Walter, and he says, "Hey Lois, how about coming back full time?" I said, "What's full time?" He said, 3 days a week. I said, "That's not full time." Knowing him and knowing his policy, I knew I had to work 32 hours a week to get any benefits. To get paid sick time, to get vacation, and that's it. So I said, "It's 4 days a week." He says, "Okay, you can have Friday. You have to go to the beauty parlor and shop." I said, "Thank you." So I worked there for 25 years. Between Cortland Gardens, Homestead, and they had Nestledown, which was like a little bit of a residence at that time. And I gave everything else up, and I came back to Stanford. He sold it, and it was never the same after that. I'll tell you, he was the best boss, and it was a pleasure going to work every day.
Was that a difficult job?
It wasn't a difficult job, it was different. But I loved it. I loved going to work. I loved my patients. I used to look at the papers on the weekend and pray that none of my patients were listed in the obits. But at that age they were. There were many of them. It was difficult because you had rules and regulations and state inspections, and he demanded perfection, Walter, and he got it.
Were there different diets for every
Everybody.
single person?
No, it depends upon the doctors. A lot of patients were on regular diets, a lot of them were diabetics and low sodiums. Every once in a while the doctor would go crazy and put somebody on an extreme diet, and I'd have to call the doctor and say, "Forget it. Don't write it like that, you know, he has limitations, fine. We'll take care of it, but you can't write it like that, because if you write it like that, then we have to write it like that unless the state comes in, and the state comes in and see that we don't coincide with your orders, we're in trouble." And the doctors generally were very good.
So it was an enjoyable job
Oh, I
in
loved
many
it.
ways.
I loved it. I loved working there. I loved the people. I loved the staff. It was a very friendly atmosphere. Working at Cortland was wonderful. He was a marvelous boss, and I'd say he was one of the best administrators in the state. He really was. We always got top ratings. Everybody knew him. Everybody in the state knew about Cortland Gardens. That's the kind of reputation we had. It was a top place in the state. Now, I don't know. I don't know anything about it, but I know it's not what it used to be.
Okay.
But what could you do?
Right.
Times change.
Now, I noticed you had a lot of other activities that were not paid, as far as I can tell from this. So would you tell us a little bit about those things?
Well, I was president of the Synagogue Sisterhood for a couple of years. When I stopped working, I became very active in the Brandeis Women's Committee. I was of the Fairfield County chapter. The Brandeis Women's Committee, you don't have to be a Brandeis graduate. Everybody thinks you have to be a Brandeis graduate, but you don't. It's a philanthropic organization. We raised money for the libraries. When Brandeis University started, the women in the Boston area got together and formed this organization to supply the library with books. That was their goal. And right up until this day, that's our big goal. We take care of and supply the library. We fund the library. Of course, we fund other things now, but for the longest time, every penny we raised went to the library. It still does. My chapter designates, every time we have a fundraiser and we send money up to the university, we designate what we want it for. It could be for library scholar, it could be library preservation, but that's where our money goes. I was president for 6 years of the chapter. I took a few years off and became president of the region, which encompasses New York, New Jersey, and Southern Connecticut. And I'm back now as president of the chapter, but this time I'm with a presidium. I refuse to take it alone. I'm older, I'm tired, I'm getting decrepit, and I didn't want to do it myself, so we're 3 of us. But I'm the ringleader. I tell the others what to do, and that's the way they want it. But I love it. We do a lot of good.
Are there any other items about your life in Stamford that you'd like to talk about? Were you active in the schools at all, or in any other organization?
I really wasn't, because when my kids were going to school, I was working.
Mm-hmm.
So I really
4 days a week. That's
I
full
worked
time. That's full
well,
time.
that's right. But prior to that, before I came back to Stanford, when I was traveling, I worked 5 days a week. You know, and unfortunately, my mother was here, so things got done. But I really wasn't. Oh, I went to all school functions at, things like when the open school week, but I was never active in PTAs or anything like that. My son joined the Cub Scouts, and after 1 year he didn't want it anymore, so that took care of that. But I always supported. I was always active in the synagogue. I was on the synagogue board years ago for 3 years, and I got off the board again. I was on the board again a few years ago, and I got off that. And now, no, I'm really not. I support my library. I love my library. My Harry Bennett branch is my second home.
Well, that's a good place.
Oh, God, I love that library. My husband absolutely adored it. He retired before me, and he used to go up to the library 3-4 times a week. He was an avid reader, and so am I.
Would you like to tell us a little about your husband's involvement in Stanford?
My husband was not involved. He was very involved. He was a research chemist. He was very involved with his job. When he left Cyanamid, he went to Glamarine as a vice president in charge of research. He never really was active in Stanford in community politics or organizations. He left that to me.
Fine,
That's it. If I said to him, we're going to, the synagogue's having a dance, we're going, okay, when is it? But he, no, he never really was active in town. But everybody knew he was Lois's husband.
Okay.
All right?
Yes. Did you do any traveling you would like to talk about? Were you ever in Israel, for example?
No, that's my one regret, that we've never gone to Israel. And I said to my daughter one day, before I die, I want to go to Israel. And she says, so go. We did a lot of traveling. Eddie and I did. We went to Europe several times, went to South America, we cruised, we did a lot of things. And after he died, I did some traveling with a friend. She was also a widow. And we did a lot of cruising, she and I. And we did, but never went to Israel. That, as I say, was my one regret. but we never got to Israel. I don't know why, we just never did. So I came home from work one day and he said to me, "You want to go to the Canary Islands for a song?" I said, "Sure, when are we leaving?" He says, "Well, you got 2 dates to choose from. Choose which one is good for you." And we went to the Canary Islands. And that was it. You know, we went to Spain, we went to Europe, we traveled, we did. We enjoyed it.
Do you have any reflections on what it meant to live in Stamford? You know, an overview
I
of,
look at Stamford now. I don't know how long you've been in Stamford. I'm sure a long time. Are you from Stamford?
no,
Okay.
neither of us are. Julie's been here quite a long time. And I'm only here 36 years, which doesn't count at all.
You're what we would call a sugar coming up.
Right.
No, the first time we drove up to Stamford when we knew we were coming up here. We came up to ride around and see what it was like. And there was still the trolley tracks on Atlantic Square. And my in-laws came up. We came up by car with them. They wanted to see what it was like. And it was unbelievable. It was a country, you know, it was the country. No turnpike, right? No turnpike. The Plaza Theater was downtown, and the Stamford Theater was downtown. It was adorable. I loved it. Absolutely loved the thought of it. I look around now, and there are times when I say, why am I still living in the city? You know? But that's progress. I watched Stamford grow, and it's unbelievable. Every time I look around, there's another building going up or something, and it's quite a place. I love it. I do. I love living in Stamford. I wish both my kids were here, but only one is. My son got married and lived in Woodside Village, and then they moved to Richfield. I considered myself the luckiest person in the world because my daughter was married and was living in Stamford with her kids. My son was married and living in Richfield with his kids. The 2 boys from Richfield used to come down almost every Saturday and spend Saturday with us. My son would drop them off on his way to work. He had a business in Old Greenwich. So, you know, and Sunday we'd take a ride and go up there. I'd stop at the kosher deli and bring pastrami and corned beef and cornbread, you know, and all that good stuff. We'd go up there for lunch. In half an hour, we were in Richfield. Now they're in Colorado. That was the worst day of my life when they came and told us they were moving to Colorado. It was in November of 2000. And when they left the house, my husband said, when they move, I'll never see them again. And he didn't. He died in July of 2001. And he never saw them again.
well, it's a good family history overall.
Yeah. I go out there, I went out there in November of that year. And I go out there at least once, twice a year. Every other Thanksgiving. I go to
Are you a
Colorado.
skier?
No. No. I'm not a skier. No, I go out to see my kids. My grandson, there are 2 boys, 27 and 24. And I'm Bubby Love to them. You know? They call, hi Bub. You know, and I have a 24-year-old in town, my daughter's oldest from her first marriage, and I have a 12-year-old, my David. That's my life.
Well, you look very well. This is such an interesting life.
Yes.
I thank you very much
I
for
thank you.
contributing to our archives.